do we have a good one for you today? Today is going to be the first episode where we dive more specifically into eating disorders. So I will say a trigger warning here. We will be diving deep into the different kinds of eating disorders, diving deep into how a diagnosis is made. And this podcast is going to be for informational purposes only. And because each person is so unique, if you can resonate to some of the information in today's episode, please consult your healthcare professional or a therapist for any medical questions. So today we are joined by the eating disorder therapist, Harriet Frew. Harriet and I connected a couple of months ago when I was a guest on her podcast, the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. I will link the episode specifically in the show notes. And she is joining us today in a conversation where we will talk about, number one, her own story battling bulimia nervosa as a teen, her recovery process, and how she turned her struggles into her mission to help others recover from eating disorders. We talk about the distinction between eating disorders and disordered eating. We will give you an overview of the most common eating disorders, the difference between anorexia nervosa and atypical anorexia. We also talk about 3 things to do as first steps if you suspect that you may have an eating disorder, the association between eating disorders and dieting, and 5 reasons why there's such a resistance to change and healing, even with the large cost that comes with struggling with either eating disorders or disordered eating patterns. So whether you are struggling with chronic dieting, you are struggling with your relationship with food, you may suspect that you have an eating disorder or someone in your life may have developed an eating disorder, this podcast is going to be so valuable for you because this doesn't just touch on the topic of eating disorders, but our entire relationship with food and our bodies and how it can affect the quality of our lives and our behaviors. So I will jump into our conversation with Harriet Frew. But before I do so, if you haven't joined us in our live exclusive private Food Freedom Fridays, where we do coaching over coffee on Zoom, then we would absolutely love to see you there. This is where we talk about all things intuitive eating, answering questions when it comes to body image and establishing healthy habits and learning how to develop a healthier relationship with food, with your body, with yourself, changing your mindset. We do a lot of mindset work and uncovering our blind spots. And it's just a really fun space where you get to ask your questions, be part of conversations, be part of a community. So here's what you need to do. Get on the list and I will send you the private link, and it will be me, you, and a small group of women from this community just like you. To do so, you can go to sabrinamagna.com/coffee, where you will also find the link in the show notes. All right, let's get into today's episode.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Sabrina. I'm great to be here. Yeah, so my name's Harriet Frew. I am an eating disorder therapist. I've worked in this field for a very long time now. And I came to this as a wounded healer. I had bulimia in my late teens, early 20s, and I decided about the age of 23 that I wanted to work with people with eating disorders. Very much back in the day, had a very kind of idealistic view, wanted to change the world, all of that. But it was good. It's led me down a good path. So so basically for the last almost 20 years now, I offer a one-to-one therapy for clients. I now train counselors and therapists to do my job. My podcast, I started that in 2020, the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. Yeah, I love doing that. I've recently started a Patreon so people can get extra episodes. And yeah, I'm just continue to be very passionate about what I do actually all these years later. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Yeah. And what you described, you mentioned that you are a wounded healer. So you have gone through your own history with an eating disorder. So you mentioned that that was in your teenage years. So what was that point for you when either, for me, it was hitting my diet rock bottom. And what was that point for you when you started getting help and really realizing that something needed to be done?
I guess for me, I knew actually quite early on that things weren't right, actually, and I was quite motivated to seek help. But back in the day, there was really not a lot of help available, unless you were emaciated on death's door. And although I had a brief period of being underweight, for most of my eating disorder, actually, I looked as though I was healthy. I was like normal weight, although I was really struggling, sort of binging and purging, etc. But I think for me, it was a number of different things that really kind of motivated me to change. Like, I really didn't like the purging behavior, particularly. It gave me so much kind of, I felt a lot of self-loathing, self-disgust. It really interfered with so many things. So that was like a big sort of moving away from motivator, because I really wanted to stop purging. And I think once I decided that I wanted to work in eating disorders, I suddenly had a bigger purpose and something greater to work towards. So I think that really helped me, because it was a massive magnet, something kind of bigger than the eating disorder, bigger than myself. And I think I'm very sort of purpose driven. I feel I'm kind of here to do things, really. So once I tapped into that energy as well, that really was like a kind of light at the end of the tunnel. And then I guess I pursued lots of different avenues, really. Like, it was a lot of things. Like, I went away, I went traveling for a while to just kind of escape my environment, which was kind of healthy for a period. I'm not saying that you should necessarily run away from your problems, but it was kind of a healthy thing for me to do for a while. I spoke to friends a lot. Like, some of my really good friends to this day were almost like we were kind of our reciprocal counselors for each other. I did a lot of reading. I started volunteering in eating disorders when I was sort of on my recovery road. And then I sort of finally managed to get some therapy sort of right towards the end. So it was a whole combination of things, really.
Yeah. And Harriet, we have a lot in common, because you mentioned kind of going to travel to, I wouldn't so much say for me it was escaping my environment, but putting myself out of my comfort zone. And that really was a huge factor in helping me plant that seed in my eating disorder recovery, and also not looking the part, which often can make people feel like they're not sick enough to reach out for help or get that support. And before we dive a little bit deeper, because we haven't really done a specific episode on eating disorders. So a lot of what we've talked about is dieting and disordered eating behaviors. And there is a spectrum. And I'm sure that there's some people in my audience who are very interested in knowing, what is the difference between an eating disorder and disordered eating?
Yeah, I think great question. And I mean, I guess, to if you have an eating disorder, you meet diagnostic criteria, like normally that they're kind of the psychiatric and DSM-5 criteria. That's sort of what it is in the UK. So you normally have to sort of tick specific boxes, I guess. And so you have to be doing certain behaviors for a certain number of times a week. It might be about your kind of weight. It might be about sort of having periods or not having periods, all things like that. So I guess, if you have an eating disorder, you fall into, it's in a nice, neat diagnostic box. Whereas I guess disordered eating, you might exhibit many of those same behaviors that someone with an eating disorder has, but maybe at the not the same intensity and frequency as someone with a full-blown eating disorder. But I think in society, we often think of like eating disorders as this sort of like little narrow group of things over here that we don't really relate to. We think of like the white, thin, emaciated female often, don't we? And actually, I guess we're all on a spectrum between full and healthy relationship with food and full-blown eating disorder. And actually, many of us are kind of in between. And it's much more helpful to realize that, and to realize that 85% as well of people with eating disorders are not underweight. So there's many people out there that are struggling with an eating disorder, but they don't look as though they have one.
Wow. So that's a massive statistic for anyone who didn't fully understand that 85% of people struggling with eating disorders are not clinically underweight. And I think that's a really big statistic to keep in mind, because like I was saying before, a lot of the times we think that eating disorders have a look, when most of the time it's mental. It's what's going on inside of our minds, and being able to really recognize that maybe I do deserve help. Maybe I do deserve some of that support. And anyone who's listening right now who might know that they have disordered eating habits, right? Whether they're binging or occasionally purging or over-exercising and really feeling obsessed with food, and they might be asking themselves, oh my God, do I have an eating disorder? Is this something that I have to really look into? What would you say to those people who might be asking themselves those questions? What would be the first step for them to get some clarity on where they're at right now?
Well, I guess the first thing is perhaps just to take it seriously. Like if you are waking up in the morning and you're preoccupied with food and your body image and it's really interfering with your day-to-day life, even if you think, oh, I'm not sure if I meet a diagnosis, I think it's really important to take your symptoms seriously, to reach out for help. I mean, I'd say like in the UK, I guess you've got an equivalent probably in the US or whatever, but in the UK we have like the Beat Eating Disorders website, which is a great, like, it's the National Association for Eating Disorders. It's a place where you can go and you can like read up on all the different diagnoses, get more information. So I'd say like, it's the best thing to do initially is to go and like educate yourself. Another thing is, I think, to tell someone, to tell someone close to you, someone who you get a sense can be trusted, who will listen, who will accept, who's not going to judge. I guess someone you can just say it out loud to, really, because I think actually saying it out loud is a very big step. And then I say the third thing is, maybe if you feel ready, you could go and speak to a professional. But I guess, again, like, I'm just thinking like in the UK as well, not all of our doctors in the sort of general practice are very knowledgeable about eating disorders. So sometimes it's helpful to ask if you can speak to someone who is a specialist in mental health or eating disorders. And I'd say if you don't get a really validating, helpful response first time, not to be put off, because I think we have got a real lag in the system in terms of people being aware, and to like, to try again, basically. But
yeah, and I think I would agree, not just in the UK, but I've worked with some clients who had reached out to help, therapists, psychologists who claimed to be specializing in eating disorders, but had never really been in the body or in the skin of someone who had struggled with an eating disorder. And they had told me some of the advice that they had gotten. For example, if you have this urge to binge, put dish soap all over your food to stop yourself from eating it. And some of the pieces of advice that I heard from people who reached out to me after struggling so hard were really heartbreaking, because these are people who you put your trust in, you really put your life in, and you feel like you're getting advice that doesn't really hear you for where you're at in your journey.
Yeah, no, it's so true, isn't it? I mean, I think it's quite sad that we're still in this place, but I think, a lot of general practitioners, I'm thinking in the UK, like they have, I think, about 2 hours training on eating disorders. I mean, I think that is changing, but it's so limited. So there's a lot of people that just aren't aware. So yeah, it's important, isn't it? If you don't get that validation, that understanding response first time, don't give up. Trust yourself, trust that you have these symptoms, and pursue different avenues.
Yeah. And you mentioned talking about it. That can be so powerful, because especially like for me, I felt so much shame that I didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to reach out to anyone. And then that shame further isolates you. And then the isolation, it almost feeds the compulsions to keep doing those behaviors. And it really does become like this vicious feedback loop. So having that one person, even just one person that you feel like you can reach out to, and verbalizing what you're going through can be extremely powerful.
Yeah, no, I so agree. And I mean, in a way, and when you speak to someone as well, you're not looking for them to fix it or anything. You're just wanting someone to hear you, really, and to just kind of be with you in your struggle.
Yeah. So we have a lot of dieters who listen to this podcast. So I'm curious, are there any specific eating disorders that are more closely linked with a history of chronic dieting?
I think all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think as well, people will often move through different eating disorders, won't they? So I guess just to give people just a brief introduction overview. So, you have anorexia nervosa, whereas people tend to be very, very restrictive with their intake. They probably less often have kind of purging behaviours and other things, although they might do. You might lose your period. Your weight often goes to, quite low. Obviously, we rely still a lot on body mass index to evaluate whether someone has anorexia nervosa, and that is quite outdated. I think what's really important to people to recognize is that if you are strictly dieting and you are having lots of starvation symptoms, you're preoccupied with food, you're feeling faint, you're feeling dizzy, all those things, that you probably do have anorexia nervosa. And it's often termed unhelpfully atypical anorexia nervosa. I don't know why they give it that name, but just to really validate those symptoms. So anorexia tends to be more kind of restriction of food, and then also the overexercise. And I guess go on.
Yeah, do you mind if I just clarify? So to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, do you have to be diagnosed as medically underweight, or can someone who is in a quote unquote normal body size be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa as well?
So, yeah, I mean, interesting one. I mean, I think still in the UK, officially to meet like an anorexia nervosa diagnosis, your body mass index would need to be below 17.5.
Okay.
However, if you have all the symptoms, but your BMI is like within the more normal range or overweight range or whatever, you would have atypical anorexia nervosa. But then that tends to fall under another eating disorder category called OSFED, which is other specified feeding and eating disorder. So, I mean, I think even as I start to delve into it, you can start to see in a way, diagnosis has some value, but it's also a bit of a minefield. And the important thing is down to individuals and if you've got symptoms to really validate those. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. So yes, if someone has all those symptoms apart from the very low BMI, they would have atypical anorexia nervosa. Okay. And thankfully now in the UK, that is starting to be much more recognized and people can get treatment, whereas historically it wasn't.
Okay, gotcha. So we've got anorexia nervosa. What are some of the other ones to be aware of?
So then we've got bulimia nervosa. So bulimia nervosa as well is when people are very restrictive. And then that will often lead to binge eating and then purging episodes using vomiting, laxatives, or sort of overexercise. And then when someone has a binge as well, like a binge is eating a very large amount of food in a small amount of time, there's a loss of control, feeling of kind of guilt, often sort of dissociation around it. And again, like with anorexia nervosa, like a huge preoccupation with kind of weight and shape and a focus on that around your worth. So that's bulimia. And then binge eating disorder is very similar to bulimia, but without the purging. So people will restrict and then binge eat. And then if you don't fall neatly into the categories of anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating disorder, you then fall under OSFED, which is other specified feeding and eating disorder, which is where most people fall into, actually. So it's still a very valid category, but it just means that you don't fit neatly into a diagnostic box as such. So for example, it could be someone that purges after like normal eating episodes rather than binge eating. That could be an example of OSFED, and also atypical anorexia nervosa.
Okay, interesting. So I would be very interested to know your insight on this. So when I was struggling, so I did go through periods of binge eating, and then it, like you said, you kind of move through one to another, and it moved into orthorexia. And orthorexia is more of, it's not a classified eating disorder. And so I would love to know what your input is on orthorexia and where it falls within all of these categories. And if you are comfortable as well, I've talked about it very briefly, but kind of giving your insights on what this eating disorder really looks like.
Yeah, so I guess orthorexia is when someone's very preoccupied with eating very clean, really healthily, and they become very anxious around eating certain foods. So we'll like kind of eliminate food. So I guess it varies a bit, doesn't it, from person to person? Like you might like eliminate carbohydrates or gluten or dairy, or, and I guess it goes to quite an extreme level where it's beyond healthy. It's not healthy anymore. And there's more of an obsession with health, maybe, rather than weight. So I think someone with orthorexia could really fall into any of the categories of eating disorder, because if they have a very low BMI, they could go down the anorexia nervosa route. They could be suffering from orthorexia nervosa and be having binges and purges. So then they'll be under bulimia, could be under binge eating disorder as well, or under OSFED. So I guess, yeah.
Yeah, it moves and flows within one another. Resistance against getting help, against stopping these compulsive behaviors around eating. So what would you say are some of the common reasons that people, despite the huge costs that comes with an eating disorder, or even just disordered eating and chronic dieting, the huge cost that people can feel, why is there such a resistance to change and healing?
I guess we live in a culture, don't we, where you are hugely validated for having a certain body shape or type. Thinness is very much idealized. And I think many people have experienced losing weight, suffering from disordered eating, but the world says, oh, wow, you look amazing.
Right here, putting my hand up. Yep.
So I think, if you're already a bit vulnerable with your self-esteem, a way to boost self-esteem in our toxic culture is to get external validation, isn't it, for how you look? So I think, no one wakes up one day and thinks, right, I want to pursue this road to validation. But I think it's something that we can kind of fall into. And if you don't feel good about yourself, but maybe the world is validating your body and you being super healthy or appearing to be super healthy, it is a way to kind of get a glimmer of self-esteem and feel better. Although, of course, it's not really sustainable or long lasting and you often don't love yourself. So I think there's that piece. I think as well, if you are focused on food and exercise and eating super healthy, you are often numbing or distracting from more difficult emotions. It's a way of simplifying life. Some of my clients have said to me sometimes, I just need to think about steps, calories, and whatever else.
Structure. I need rules. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't have to think about everything else really. So I think that can be a really big piece. If life is overwhelming and out of control, I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think controlling food is one of the few things that we can control, even if it's in quite a disordered way. And then also I think about identity. If you are known as the really fit kind of healthy person, I've worked with several people that have a very strong identity on social media as the fit and healthy person and are struggling with massive eating disorder behind the scenes, but they get so much validation and for being this way. So it's very kind of confusing, I guess. People are very torn. So I guess lots of things.
And I can relate to, I wrote down, you mentioned 5 big things, which was if you're struggling with self-esteem and validation, then looking externally can provide even just that quick fix. And most of the time, we don't even feel better about ourselves. I've talked to so many clients who we look back on all their diet attempts and they were in smaller bodies. And I asked them, was it ever enough? Was there ever a day where you woke up and you were like, okay, now I can love myself? And the answer is never yes, because you're changing your body. You're not changing your body image. You're changing your body. You're not changing your mindset around how you feel about your body. So there is that one piece, which is looking for that self-esteem outside of yourself. The second piece, which was simplifying life. And I've had a lot of clients do the same thing, right? I just want, it's when you're going on your healing journey, we do a lot of mindset work inside my program. And at the beginning, a lot of my clients will say, like, I'm using my brain in a way that I've never had to do before, because now I'm learning how to trust myself. I'm learning how to reconnect to myself. And I'm no longer using like these boxes within what I have to stay within, the carbs and the calories. So simplifying life. The third thing that you mentioned is control, right? So a need for controlling and a lot of the times eating disorders can manifest when you're going through a big stressful divorce, a loss, grief, a big move in your life. For me, a big piece of that was going to university, moving away from home. Do you see that a lot of, not a lot, but it happens often that eating disorders do manifest during that transition from high school to being an adult and going to college and going to university? Is that something that is common?
Yeah, I think transitions are a trigger point, are they? And I think obviously there's the more obvious ones like when you're younger, but it can be at any stage of your life. I still think of something like with my older clients, sometimes when their children leave home, or maybe when they hit the menopause, or someone loses their job or something. Yeah, I think absolutely those transition points. But I think pre the transition point, there's probably been some perhaps milder struggles with mental health or not feeling good enough. So you're kind of already in a bit of a vulnerable state, I guess. So when the transition or the trigger point hits, you can be more vulnerable then to using food or body focused as a coping strategy.
Yes, and you mentioned not feeling good enough, which is a very common underlying theme to what we talk about with my clients or anyone who is struggling with the relationship with food. We want to prove if I can be structured and disciplined enough, if I can look a certain way, then I'm finally going to feel good enough. And as long as we don't dive into that specific thought and learn how to find reasons why you are good enough, regardless of and detached from your body, then that's when you can really start doing that true healing. You mentioned two other things, which is eating disorders or even disordered eating can act as a distraction from feeling our true emotions, whether we feel unhappy in our lives, we feel lonely, we feel bored. A big thing would be lacking purpose. I find that lacking purpose, so we have this goal, right? If I don't have another mission in my life, then I'm going to constantly try to go after this goal, which is shrinking my body or following my diet. So it really gives us like this light to go after. So that can be a really big one, and that identity, and it kind of goes hand in hand, because a lot of the times when we stop dieting, then we feel like we lose our purpose, and we also feel like we lose our identity, which can be a big thing to navigate, especially if you're going on this journey on your own. But with all of this and all of the resistance that can come from not wanting to let go of some of those behaviors, what would you say to someone who is feeling that resistance, who has all of these reasons why they should stay within that box and that control? What would you say to that person?
I guess I would say, like, try and do a bit of a zoom out on life. Think about, although, I'm really like finding this eating disorder is helping me feel safe, in control, numbing emotions, etc., etc. Do I really want to be using this as a coping strategy in 2 years' time or 5 years' time? So looking at the bigger picture, because I think for most people, although they might feel very ambivalent about letting go of their eating disorder, when they start to think ahead and they think, actually, if I'm still doing these behaviors down the line, actually that is more of an eye opener and kind of a wake up call, isn't it? And I guess the classic thing as well, isn't it? Like, when you're 90 and on your deathbed and you're looking back on your life, what's going to have been important to you? Is it going to have been having like the perfect body, chasing the number on the scales? Probably for most people, not. I think when they kind of talk to people that are dying and, ask them about their regrets, it's not usually about body image, is it?
Mm-hmm.
It's all about relationships and purpose and being their true self. So I think those are a couple of exercises. And I think even still, it doesn't make it always any easier for people. I think the motivational kind of chipping away needs to be done sort of slowly and gradually, and starting to feel a bit hopeful. I think sometimes people have become so resigned that, I can't change. This is all my life is ever going to be. I can't imagine myself without it. But I think even just having that hope and that possibility that things can be different opens up a powerful kind of opening for change.
Yeah. And you mentioned something, which is a podcast episode that I wanted to do. I came up with this idea a couple of weeks ago, which is really like making decisions from that future version of yourself instead of your current version. Because in the moment, there is so much angst. There's so much like this compulsion and this obsession, and you really feel closed down. And I remember for me, that moment of realizing this needs to change was when I wanted to travel. Like, I had always wanted to travel. I wanted to be a traveler, and I had this opportunity to go travel and live in Italy, and I didn't want to go because I didn't want to gain weight. I was afraid of eating carbs and eating pasta. And in that moment, it was realizing, yes, this might be one trip, but it's not just one trip, because if I don't push through the fear now, then it's going to be the trips for the rest of my life that I'm going to miss out on. And it's going to be the Sunday morning brunches that I won't be able to have my pancakes and maple syrup because I'm going to be so obsessed with the calorie and the sugar content in it. So it's really looking at, yes, right now it seems like a different life is so impossible, but what does the future version of myself need from me? And if I were to talk to that 60, 70-year-old version of myself who has healed, like really seeing that there is that version of you who can heal, what would she say, right? She would say to push through the discomfort and push through the fear and do something that really makes you feel uncomfortable, but there's so much light on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I could talk to you for so long because you have so much knowledge and so much insight, but I will wrap this up now. And for anyone who has listened to this and has gotten so much value from it, who wants to connect with you, you have your own podcast. I know that you have an amazing Instagram as well. So where can people connect with you and find you if they want to get some of your content, get some of your support?
Sure. So my website is theeatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. My podcast is The Eating Disorder Therapist, and my Instagram is The Eating Disorder Therapist _. So they're the main kind of places, really.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And if you had to say one final piece of wisdom or advice to anyone who's listening right now, what would you say to them?
I guess I would just say, like, hold on to hope, believe that recovery is possible. Because I know for myself, I never saw myself having an eating disorder for life. I really believe passionately that I would find an exit. And I think because I had that belief, I kept pursuing the exits, even when I kept meeting dead ends. So I would say that to people, really, like, hold on to hope and keep pursuing those exits.
Yeah. And we know the power of our mind and the power of belief. So if you really do know that there is a way out, then when you will hit those obstacles and there are going to be those hard days and those hard weeks, you know that that's part of the journey. It's part of it. And there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So thank you so much, Harriet. I loved our conversation. I know that our audience is going to gain a lot from it too. So I appreciate you. Thank you so much to everyone for listening, and we will see you next week on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you found it valuable, I would love if you would share it with someone you know that could benefit. If you're loving the show, don't forget to subscribe over on Apple Podcasts so you don't miss a single episode. I really love hearing feedback from you, so please leave a rating and review over on Apple to help us get in the ears of more people who need it the most. Finally, come hang out with me on Instagram at Sabrina Magna Health for more educational content and get up close and personal with me. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you on the next episode.